Have you ever lain awake at 2 a.m., next to the person you love, and realized you no longer know how to talk to them? This video isn't just about English listening practice. It's about those silent nights when words fail but hearts still ache to be understood. Through a real story from my life in Denmark, you'll hear how one midnight conversation changed everything. In love, in language, and in the way we listen to each other. The 2 a.m. question. It was one of those nights when sleep just refused to come. The Danish winter outside was silent, heavy, almost too calm. I lay there, next to my wife, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. Steady, peaceful, distant. Then out of nowhere I whispered a question that had been buried in my chest for months. Are you happy with me, really? For a few seconds the only answer was the ticking clock on the wall. Then she turned to me and said softly, "Why are you asking this at 2 a.m.? I smiled weakly. Because that's when honesty wakes up. You know, something strange happens after midnight. The world gets quieter, and suddenly the noise inside your mind becomes louder. You start hearing all the thoughts you ignored during the day. The fears, the doubts, the small regrets. That night I realized that our silence had grown heavier than our words. Living in Denmark had changed us both. The language, the culture, even the way people spoke so directly. It made me see how much I had avoided saying what I truly felt. I thought my English wasn't good enough, that my accent would make my emotions sound clumsy. So instead I said less. I smiled more. But deep down I was building a wall made of unspoken words. And maybe that's why I asked her that question. Not because I wanted a perfect answer, but because I needed to hear something, anything that reminded me we were still trying. That night she didn't give me a speech. She just reached out, held my hand and said, "Maybe we're both just tired, not of each other, but of pretending everything's fine." And that sentence hit me harder than any grammar lesson ever could. Because it wasn't perfect English. But it was perfect honesty. It made me realize that language isn't about sounding good. It's about being understood. And maybe that's where my real journey of learning English began. Not in classrooms, not with teachers, but in that quiet Danish night when two people finally decided to speak again. Sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from words you read, but from the courage to say the ones you've been afraid to speak. The silent apartment. Morning light in Denmark is soft, pale gold brushing across the white walls. The kind that makes everything look peaceful even when it isn't. Our apartment in Copenhagen was small but neat, filled with the quiet hum of routine. Yet lately the silence had started to feel heavy. Not comfortable silence, but the kind that buzzes inside your ears, reminding you that something's missing. You know that kind of silence, right? When two people share the same space but not the same world. You make coffee, they check their phone. You ask, "Do you want breakfast?" And they just nod. You tell yourself maybe it's just a phase. But deep down you know it's not. It's distance, invisible, slow, and growing. I remember watching the steam rise from my coffee cup that morning and realizing how quiet we had become. English used to be our bridge, the second language we both laughed and stumbled through. But now it felt like even that bridge had cracks. She spoke less. I listened less. And somewhere between our busy days and tired nights, connection turned into background noise. It's funny. People think learning English is about grammar or vocabulary. But when you live in a foreign country, it's more than that. It's about belonging. When you can't express yourself, you start shrinking inside your own life. Every misunderstood word feels like a small failure. Every awkward pause becomes proof that you don't fully belong. Not here, not even in your own marriage. One evening, I tried to start a conversation. I said, "Maybe we should practice English together again?" She smiled politely, the kind of smile that ends things before they begin, and said, "Maybe later." That later hung in the air for days, so we lived in that silence. Two people in love trapped between languages, too tired to try, too proud to admit we missed each other. It wasn't anger. It wasn't boredom. It was just emotional distance disguised as peace. Looking back, I think the quiet of our Danish apartment taught me one painful truth. Silence isn't the opposite of noise. It's the absence of connection. And when love stops speaking, even a cozy home can start to feel like an empty classroom. But every silence hides a reason. And ours had one too, buried in how we used to talk and then slowly forgot how. Why we stopped talking. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a fight, a betrayal, or a big emotional explosion. It was quieter than that, like watching a candle slowly burn out without realizing when the flame disappeared. When we first moved to Denmark, English was our lifeline. We spoke it every day. Clumsy, funny, imperfect sentences filled with laughter. We would correct each other, tease each other, learn together. It wasn't just language practice, it was intimacy disguised as conversation. But life got busy. Bills, work, cold mornings, endless gray skies. Slowly we spoke less. English became functional. Pass the salt. Did you pay the bill? What time tomorrow? The poetry was gone. The curiosity was gone. And when you stop playing with the language, it stops playing back. There's a strange thing about learning a foreign language with someone you love. At first, it brings you closer, but later, it can reveal how far apart you've grown. I started noticing how often I avoided speaking, afraid I'd sound stupid or say the wrong thing. She started finishing my sentences not out of impatience but out of quiet resignation. And somewhere along the way we both forgot why we started learning in the first place. It wasn't for perfect pronunciation or grammar. It was because we wanted to understand each other better, not just through words but through effort. One night during dinner I said something in English, something simple like, "I miss when we talked more." She didn't look up. She just said, "We're still talking, aren't we?" That answer, it stayed with me for days. Because yes, we were talking but not communicating. The difference is enormous. In psychology, they say connection fades not when people argue, but when they stop sharing their inner world. We stopped telling stories, stopped asking questions, stopped being curious. And when curiosity dies, love starts gasping for air. That realization hurt. Not because we didn't love each other, but because we built invisible walls with polite silence and broken English. The saddest part? I think both of us were waiting for the other to start the conversation again. But neither of us knew how to, so the silence grew thicker, the English grew weaker, and the distance, it just became normal until one day, a small misunderstanding changed everything. A single word said wrong, heard wrong, cracked that silence wide open. Lost in translation. Started with one tiny word. I said, "I'm fine," but she heard, "I don't care." That's the danger of speaking in a language that still feels like a borrowed coat. It keeps you warm, but it never quite fits. We were in the kitchen. I had just come home from work, exhausted and quiet. She asked, "How was your day?" I smiled, looked down, and said softly, "I'm fine." In my head, that meant I'm tired but happy to be home. In hers, it meant don't bother me, so she didn't. She just nodded, turned away, and washed the dishes. And that night, the distance between us wasn't measured in meters, it was measured in meaning. People underestimate how fragile communication can be when you're not using your native tongue. One misplaced word can sound cold. A missing tone can turn kindness into indifference. When your vocabulary is small, your silence grows larger. That moment became a turning point for me. Because when I saw her wiping dishes with her back turned, I realized it wasn't about language anymore. It was about fear. The fear of saying the wrong thing. The fear of not being understood. That I went to bed that night replaying that single word, fine, 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 and how much it had cost. I thought of all the other times I'd hidden behind simple phrases because I was too insecure to express myself properly in English. And then it hit me. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid mistakes, I was actually making the biggest mistake, losing connection. You see, when we stop trying to express, we stop existing fully in someone's world. Silence might feel safe, but it's a slow death for any relationship. The next morning, I did something different. I sat across from her at breakfast and said, "I think I've been using English like a shield." She looked confused, so I added, "I use simple words so I don't sound wrong, but that also means you never really hear me." Her eyes softened. She said, "Then stop being perfect. Just talk." That was it. No lecture. No advice. Just an invitation. And maybe that's when I truly started learning English, not from books or teachers, but from a woman who reminded me that love doesn't need flawless grammar. It just needs courage to be clumsy. That small misunderstanding, born from one short word, became the seed of change. Because from that day on, I decided to stop hiding behind fine. I decided to speak imperfectly, honestly, and completely. The turning point. You don't really notice the exact moment your life changes. It never comes with background music or flashing lights. Sometimes it begins quietly with a decision so small it almost feels invisible. For me, that moment was when I decided to stop studying English and start living it. That morning I looked at my wife and said, "Let's talk in English every night." Not to practice, just to be real. She raised an eyebrow, amused. "Even about hard things?" she asked. I nodded. "Especially about hard things." And that's how our midnight ritual began. After dinner, after the city had gone still, we'd sit by the window with mugs of tea and just talk. Slowly, awkwardly, honestly. Sometimes our grammar was terrible. Sometimes we misunderstood each other completely. But for the first time in months, we were laughing again. Not because of the jokes, but because we were finally connecting. Here's what I learned. The real purpose of language isn't perfection, it's connection. Grammar books can't teach you empathy. Vocabulary lists can't teach you how to listen. But one honest conversation can teach you both. There's actually a bit of science behind this. Psychologists call it mirror listening. When two people truly listen, their brains start to sync. The rhythm of speech, the emotional tone, even heart rate can align. That's why deep conversations feel healing. Your nervous system literally feels heard. And that's exactly what started happening to us. The more we talked, the less we cared about mistakes. The less we cared about mistakes, the more fluent we became. It's funny, isn't it? When you stop chasing perfection, learning finally feels natural. Some nights we talked about silly things like the weird Danish weather or how every street name had too many vowels. Other nights we confessed our insecurities, how lonely we felt, how hard it was to adapt, how sometimes English felt like a wall instead of a bridge. But the more we shared, the stronger that bridge became. That was the turning point, the night I realized that learning English wasn't just about the language. It was about reclaiming connection. It was about learning to listen with patience, to speak without fear, and to let honesty sound messy but true. And maybe that's what love really is. Two people trying, failing, misunderstanding, and still choosing to listen anyway. Learning to listen again. Our little midnight talks became the heartbeat of our days. Every night, no matter how tired we were, we would sit by the window, wrap ourselves in a blanket, and talk, slowly, softly in English. Not to improve pronunciation or vocabulary, but to remember what it felt like to truly hear each other. At first it was awkward. We would pause a lot, searching for words. Sometimes I'd say something wrong and she'd laugh. Sometimes she'd say something that didn't make sense and I'd laugh back. But that laughter, that warm, clumsy human sound, started to melt the distance between us. We began to listen differently. Instead of waiting for our turn to speak, we listened to understand. That's harder than it sounds. Most people think they're listening, but really they're just preparing their next sentence. When you stop doing that, when you actually listen, you can hear feelings hiding behind words. Psychologists say real listening activates the same part of the brain that empathy does. That means every time you truly listen to someone, you're literally practicing compassion. Maybe that's why our English got better. Not because we studied more, but because we cared more. I remember one night she said, "When you listen to me like this, I feel like I can breathe." And I replied, "When you speak like this, I finally understand you, not just your English, but your silence." We started using our mistakes as lessons. If one of us mispronounced a word, we'd repeat it together slowly until it sounded right. But instead of feeling embarrassed, we'd smile. Because it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. The Danish winter outside kept getting darker, colder, but inside our small apartment, something new was growing: warmth, fluency, intimacy. It was as if every simple sentence we shared was building a bridge back to each other. And here's what surprised me most. The more we learned to listen to each other, the better we listened to ourselves. English became not just a language, but a mirror reflecting who we were, what we feared, what we still hoped for. Sometimes we ended our talks without solving anything. No big conclusions, no dramatic kisses, just two people breathing in the same rhythm, in the same language, finally at peace. That's when I realized. Learning to listen again isn't about English or Danish or any language. It's about love, the kind that speaks softly enough for the heart to finally hear. The night of truth. It was 2:03 a.m. The kind of night when time feels slower, when the city outside seems to hold its breath. We sat on the couch, both wrapped in silence, not the heavy kind anymore, but the quiet before something honest is about to happen. She looked at me and said, almost in a whisper, "Can I tell you something without you correcting my English?" I smiled, a little nervous. "Promise." She took a deep breath. "Sometimes I feel like I disappear when we speak English. Like my words are small, not strong enough." That hit me like a wave, because I had felt the same way. That invisible shrinking every time I searched for words I didn't know. I said softly, "Me too. Sometimes I feel like English hides my real self. But maybe that's not English's fault. Maybe it's mine for not trying to be real through it." She looked down, then said, "Maybe we both hide behind grammar." We both laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was true. That night we stopped talking about small things. We talked about fear, about loneliness, about how moving to Denmark had made us feel like guests in our own lives, about how we missed home and yet didn't know where home was anymore. And the most beautiful part, we did it all in English, broken, messy, honest English. There were pauses, wrong tenses, strange phrases, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that for the first time we weren't translating our feelings. We were living them. That I remember saying, "I think I was afraid of losing you in translation." She nodded and replied, "But maybe love is the only thing that never gets lost." Silence again, but this time it was full. Full of meaning. Full of understanding. Full of peace. If someone had recorded us that night, it would have sounded like an imperfect English lesson. But to us it was something sacred. Every word was a bridge. Every mistake was an act of trust. Every pause was a breath of love. That's the truth that came out at 2 a.m. Language doesn't divide people, fear does. And when you stop fearing mistakes, you start hearing truth. When she finally leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for listening," I realized I hadn't just learned English. I'd learned intimacy. Because the real language of love isn't perfect words. It's imperfect honesty spoken softly at 2 in the morning. What love sounds like. The morning after that 2 a.m. talk felt different. The same Danish winter sun shone weakly through the window, but the air inside our small apartment felt lighter, warmer, as if silence itself had changed texture. For the first time in a long while, we didn't need to fill every moment with words. Our conversation the night before had already said everything. Over breakfast, she smiled and said, "Our English is still bad." I laughed. "Maybe. But our love sounds better now." That line just slipped out, but the more I thought about it, the more true it became. Love has a sound. Sometimes it's a word, sometimes it's a sigh, sometimes it's just someone staying when you run out of sentences. That night had taught me something schools never did. Fluency isn't about how fast you speak, but how deeply you connect. You can memorize 10,000 words and still fail to touch someone's heart. But if you dare to say one imperfect sentence honestly, that's real communication. And in Denmark, people often say, "Der still kærlighed." There is quiet love. I used to think it meant love without words. But now I think it means love that listens. We still practice English together. Still make mistakes. Still laugh when one of us says something weird like, "I'm cold like a cucumber." But now every laugh feels like progress, not in language but in closeness. Sometimes when we walk home through the cold Copenhagen streets, she'll slip her hand into mine and whisper, "Thank you for not giving up on talking." And I'll say, "Thank you for never giving up on listening." Because that's what love sounds like. Not perfect English, not perfect people, just two voices choosing to understand each other even when the words get lost. And maybe that's the real secret of learning a language. You don't just learn new words. You learn new ways to care, to listen, to love. So if you're struggling with English or with someone you love, remember this. Don't aim to speak perfectly. Aim to speak truthfully. Because love, like language, doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. It just needs to be spoken. That's what I learned that night in Denmark. That the most powerful word you'll ever say isn't perfect. It's "I'm here."